We're surrounded by.
With the first pick in the 2024 NFL Draft.
Welcome into another episode of the Daft on Draft podcast. I am your host, Cory Kinnan, fake Cory Kinnan on Twitter. Again, love the support that I've gotten so far as the show has blossomed again, as we are now entering the finale of this What to Watch For When Scouting series. We're going to talk about offensive line today, but again, love the support. If you could continue, like, subscribe, do your thing on whatever app you listen to. But man, I'm just thrilled to be back. Thrilled for the support that I've received. But we've got a long conversation with Brandon Thorn of Trench Warfare ahead of us. Again, Brandon is a guru, all things offensive line, all things defensive line. I got him to speak about offensive line play. So I am just thrilled with how the conversation turned out, thrilled with how the series turned out. Again, I hope you guys enjoyed it. But for now, this is the Daft on Draft podcast, and let's dive into that conversation with Brandon on what to watch for when scouting offensive line. All right, and now for the finale of our what to watch for from when watching Position X, we have offensive line, and why not save the best for last, right? So I will say evaluating offensive linemen is probably one of my favorite positions, and I couldn't be more thrilled with the guest to come on and talk about what to watch for when watching offensive linemen, as well as Brandon Thorn from Trench Warfare is joining the Daft on Draft podcast. So Brandon, welcome to the show.
Hey, yeah, thanks for having me, man. I'm glad we're able to do this. Should be fun.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it. It's been, we've had Dane Brugler to talk about wide receivers, Cody Alexander to talk about corners, just a wealth of knowledge. And so getting you on to talk about it felt only right. Only Brandon can talk about offensive linemen for this podcast. So, Brandon, before we dive into offensive linemen, you've had quite the journey through football to get where you are, launching your Substack, very involved in OL Mastermind. So just walk us through kind of your journey into football and how you got where you are today.
Yeah, so I was about 7, almost 8 years into a military career in the Air Force, and I was a diehard football fan. I was writing for some websites for free, like while I was active duty, and stationed in Georgia before Colorado. So I took leave a couple times. I went to the Senior Bowl on the behalf of some smaller websites and things like that, and just tried to get involved as much as I could being active duty. About 8 years in, I had an opportunity to get out of my contract early. They were downsizing at the time. I had just met my soon-to-be wife, and I just got this courage, to say, hey man, if I'm going to do this, and try to get into football full time, now's the time. Just based on my age, the situation, everything, not having kids yet. So, I just started to kind of transition out of active duty. I went into the Guard for a couple of years to help that transition, started going to school, used a GI Bill. But in the midst of that, joined social media. This was like 2014 or so at the time when I became active on Twitter, at least. And just started reaching out to people just in scouting in general, and quickly became introduced to a guy named Ted Sundquist, who was the former general manager of the Broncos, and he was an Air Force veteran as well, living kind of right by me in Colorado. So I just kind of reached out to him, noticed he had a website, not a lot of content on there. He hosted a podcast, and I just kind of told him my story, and we connected and eventually started writing for his site, and then we joined together for a podcast. And really through that podcast that we hosted, it was through something called The Football Educator was the name of his website. I just got to meet a lot of people, and one of those people was Charles Bentley, former NFL offensive lineman who was training guys in Phoenix, Arizona. And through that, just got connected with him, and he invited me to his inaugural clinic in 2016 in Arizona. So I went to that, and then met some more people. Eventually on the podcast, I think we had Duke Manyweather, about 2014, 2015 timeframe. And then me and him really connected, and Just started picking his brain a lot, and then in 2018 he started Offensive Line Masterminds and brought me on board to do like film work and stuff like that. But and also I saw like on social media at that time, 2014, ish, nobody was really talking about offensive line except like Duke, really, and maybe LaCharles here and there. So I just thought that there was room for me there, to provide kind of a different angle, more like a scouting based angle. Because I really wanted to be an NFL scout. That's why that was my main goal. But then as the media thing started to grow, I just figured if I'm going to make the media thing stick, I needed to have a niche. And I just focused on offensive line, and it just kind of grew. And now that's, what I do full time. And I'm just really just thankful for where I'm at now. And I just love it, man. I just offensive and defensive line. I just feel like it's so meaningful to the game, outside of quarterback, especially. And there's just so many layers to it too. It's just, you can never really learn enough, and it's fun.
It is a lot of fun, and I think that's what I love about doing this podcast. And just the wealth of, like, you can just Google coaches clinics on YouTube, and you could spend all day on YouTube just watching coaches clinics. And
Yep.
There's just so many cool people in the industry that I've had the privilege to meet at the combine and things like that too. And I've just gone out, and again, you said that courage is really what it is. And but yes, we're here to talk offensive line, Brandon. And so
yeah,
throughout every single position that I've covered, I always start with the question with every expert that I've had on is, what are your non-negotiables? Like, there are some things that, whether it's wide receiver, quarterback, running back, whatever it is, if a player doesn't have this particular thing or can't develop this particular thing, like, it's a non-negotiable. Like, good luck. So when you are taught, when we're looking at offensive linemen, and let's be more specific, and let's start with offensive tackles. Like, what are your non-negotiables when you're watching an offensive tackle?
Yeah, so offensive tackle is a little different because then I think there's more of a premium on athletic ability and size thresholds and things like that. But I mean, just going back generally a little bit here first and laying the foundation, I think starting with terms that are a little obscure, but we can go into them, being tough, smart, athletic enough, and I think quickness is more important than just sheer athleticism, especially on paper, athleticism, like combine wise and things like that. Like, but the toughness and smartness, smart part, is, kind of easy to, get lost in that and not really know what it is. But over the years, so like toughness, I think is a huge part of it, because offensive linemen, you have to play hurt first of all. All the guys, all offensive linemen are pretty much playing hurt. I mean, most football players are playing hurt, but offensive line in particular, especially because you're 300 plus pounds, it's extremely difficult to do that. So, finding out how a guy is wired is very difficult, especially for media. Us in the media and things like that. That's kind of the benefit of being an NFL scout, I think, is getting to talk to the people that, are around the player, coaches and things like that. And I've had the benefit of talking to some coaches, which certainly helps, but maybe not as much as I would like for all the guys. But I think that's the first part that you should probably start with, is trying to identify their competitive toughness, is what I was taught through the scouting academy to term it as. And I really like that term. But in terms of seeing that on the field wise film, it's effort, really. It's the ability to finish blocks. And that doesn't necessarily mean, pancaking a guy and driving a guy into the ground. Although, of course, if you could do that, that's great. But it's more so staying in between the defender and, the ball through the whistle consistently, regardless of game situation, opponent, things like that. And I think if a guy can just do that on film, and he does that consistently relative to other guys you're watching, I think that gives him a huge leg up. And that typically is something that sticks, and will transfer pretty well to the next level. If we're looking at college guys, it is. So I think competitive toughness is a huge part of it, because so much of playing offensive line is a mindset, and imposing your will and trying to deliver body blows and things like this that get passed around on, Twitter and terms like that, but I mean, there's a lot of meaning behind that, and it's real. Just talking to these guys over the years and being in the rooms, it's very, important. So I think that's huge, competitive toughness. And then smarts, I term it mental processing, another scouting academy term, but um, and I think actually we could probably use play speed. I think that's probably better because it encompasses, it's basically the sum of mental processing and athletic ability that equals your play speed. And the beautiful thing about offensive line, and I think this translates to other positions as well, like if you're a really quick processor and you're not super athletic, your play speed can still be really good. And the inverse is true as well. If you're extremely athletic and maybe not the quickest processor, your play speed can still be really good. So, um, I think play speed and competitive toughness would probably be the two biggest things that I would talk about for all offensive line positions. And then again, just you mentioned tackle. I think sheer athletic ability, movement skills, quickness, redirectability, ability to recover. Just because you're going to be playing in more space against better athletes, yeah, then that becomes more of a premium for tackle, I would say.
Awesome. Yeah, we'll get to those lower half tools, and I'm really excited to break down. So yeah, now I've kind of broken, and again, it's way more deep than breaking it down into 5 categories, right? But breaking offensive line play down into 5 categories, and just kind of breaking each of those categories down. And I think I want to start with base because I think that's kind of, it's literally the foundation, right, of an offensive tackle.
Yep.
And I think from my perspective as an evaluator, I've been burned on some guys who have really awesome tools, but have balance issues. And I in the past have said like, oh, they can correct those balance issues. And then traditionally they haven't at the NFL level. I think for me, I think Evan Neal is a pretty good example of that for me. And he's only going into his 3rd season, right? Like Evan Neal, but he's a freak, right? A freak athlete. But there was quite a bit of evidence of balance issues on his Alabama tape. And I was like, he can overcome that. He's a specimen, he's a freak, and it hasn't happened yet. Not to say that it can't. And so I think base is a good place to start with. So when we're talking about an offensive tackle's base, kind of what are the ground points there for you?
Yeah, I mean, Evan Neal's a really good one to bring up for this topic. And but yeah, we won't go into that unless you want to. But that's a really interesting case study. But yeah, base, I think, yeah, I mean, it starts from the ground up. You're 100% right. And you can't. First of all, like you block people with your feet before your hands, right? You have to get into position with your body, and then interact with them with your hands and block them, and create leverage and things like that with your hands. But body positioning, and base and weight distribution, I think would probably fall into this, which is kind of like balance. Just how well can a guy maintain their weight distribution? You want it to be basically 50-50, on each foot, on each side. And that's going to allow them to do things like redirect more seamlessly with less lag time, as opposed to if they were leaning one way or the other or a little top heavy or things like that. And then there is going to be that little lag time, and every little second, counts, the higher up in level of football you get. So, I think those things are extremely important. And some of the notes that you have here, like I think we kind of touched on that right away, is weight distribution. Like, where does his weight sit? In terms of pass protection, traditional coaching points, head out of the block is important. Kind of that flat back approach, so you can have your eyes up and see things in front of you, is huge. Bending, of course, at the ankle, knees, and hips. Those are kind of the core key joints of all football players, really. But having mobility in those 3 joints, I think, is critical. I come from a little bit of a personal training background too, and I, just doing assessments on people. I feel like having somebody, and this is something Duke and I have talked about a lot with evaluating players, is if you're able to ever get into this position or see guys do this, like that's why I like watching warm-ups and stretching, at the Senior Bowl and things like that, because you can get at least a little eye into their flexibility and mobility. in terms of ankle, knee, and hip, how they're able to bend at those three joints. Because if they are able to bend and they're flexible and they're strong through a full range of motion in those areas, then their pad level is going to be good, or chances are they're going to have a better chance of having good pad level. Because we look at pad level, but that's just kind of the surface of it. Like, pad level broken down is really a function of mobility in your ankles and your knees and your hips. And if you're stiff there, you're going to have high pads. And so I think looking at those key areas of the body is really important. You could see that in guys' stances sometimes. That's one way, the stretching element, just seeing them move around. And then after, the snap, how are they able to maintain those things? And then a lot of other things start to come into play, like technique and timing and all this other stuff. But in terms of shear base, shear flexibility, and those things, those are some ways that I kind of look at it and see it. Yeah, you also mentioned like the ability to stay square and pass protection again, usually is going to help you a lot. There's some guys though that don't necessarily stay super square and they make it work for them. I think of Deion Dawkins. He does not stay square in pass protection very often. Teron Armstead, will open up his hips, especially like when he was in his prime, for the Saints, but also Dolphins. Like some guys are able to kind of make things work. And that's another beauty of offensive line play. We try to, we want to have these well-defined boxes, but man, one of the things I've learned over the years is like, you have to be adaptable in evaluating, because some guys can just make stuff work that isn't traditional, and that's a little unconventional. So those are a couple of guys that do that in pass protection. But generally, you want to stay square for as long as you can because it eliminates a two-way go for a pass rusher. If you're opened up to them, your shoulder and hip is going to be, facing closer towards the sideline. And if they cross your face, you're going to have to open up, and there's a little bit of a lag time to redirect to cut off an inside counter. That's, I think, the thinking behind staying square as long as you can, because then you're able to redirect way easier if you're square. It's just, it can be very sharp and precise. Whereas if you're turned, it's kind of a open, you have to swing the gate open kind of thing. But yeah, so it's, I always come back to like, identifying sort of these baseline things, these traditional things that are, by and large important, but always just keeping it in the back of your mind that there's some guys that can just make stuff work that doesn't look how maybe you expect it to or want it to.
Yeah, I love that. I love that a lot. I actually want to move to lower half tools now, just because we hit on a lot of those key terms. I think, hip, knee, ankle flexibility, redirect, kind of things that I wanted to hit on talking about lower half. So I think I want to jump there next, especially with offensive tackles.
Yeah.
You hit on it right at the beginning. Like there's an athletic threshold that, that you have to meet. Unless you are like a massive outlier in terms of size that, I think of maybe DeJuan Jones as a reference here. DeJuan Jones's foot speed is excellent for being 6'8", 400 pounds. I think it helps him a lot as well. But like he has such a natural anchor that like even if his pads are high, like it's very hard to work through his chest. So like, but that's kind of a different story. But you have to have some sort of athleticism again to redirect, like you said, if somebody tries to cross your face from the outside shoulder back to the inside, having that ability. Having the ability to get to the boundary or climb in the run game, having the knee bend that you had mentioned. When I look at edge rushers, one of my non-negotiables when I watch an edge rusher is if you don't have bend, like I have a hard time buying in because it might work to win with speed to power and straight through the chest at the college level, but when you get to the NFL level, these guys aren't going to let you win through their chest hardly at all, if ever. And so, like if you can't win outside shoulder, then but that also translates to offensive tackles then, right? Like, well, you have to be able to block bend. You have to have the knee bend to be able to mirror some of these guys. And so I think I want to start there with lower half tools. And if there's anything else you would like to hit on there in terms of that, but specifically, I want to talk a little bit about run game here, right? I mentioned getting to the boundary, being able to beat the defender through the spot. But that's not always a good thing. I've seen some really athletic offensive tackles who play really out of control in space. And so there's an element of taking good angles as well, an element of being able to throttle down and actually find work in space as well. Right.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I mean, so focusing on the run game with movement skills and things like that, I think it all starts in pass protection as well. But run game we'll focus on here is snap timing and getting off the ball first. First significant movement usually leads to first meaningful contact, and typically, if you initiate first meaningful contact in the run game, you're going to win that rep. Not always, but I think that's going to at least improve your chances pretty dramatically. So I always start with how guys get off the ball, and that's just timing the snap, being in tune with the guy next to you, and just as a unit collectively. That comes obviously in practice, I think, more than anything. But if you can kind of move as one as an offensive line unit, and you're getting off the ball quickly, man, you're going to have such a leg up because you are going to be that much closer to beating a defender to the spot, initiating first meaningful contact. And, when you do that, you're able to create movement, create lift, deliver power and things like that. And it just puts the ball in your court as a blocker so much. So I really think that's a huge thing. And that could be improved upon, snap timing, that is, which is pretty cool too. So if a guy doesn't have it, it's not necessarily it doesn't, totally like, cancel them out or whatever. You shouldn't be too, hard on them necessarily. But if they do have it, it could be a real game changer. So that's huge. And then, from there, after first meaningful contact on a block, we're talking first level here, especially because, getting out on the move in space, that incorporates a bunch of other stuff. But first level, say like a base block, I'm thinking of a guard on a 3 technique, and you got to kick this guy out and create a lane off your backside. Starts with snap timing, getting into the fit, the run block fit first, with power, good pad level. That's going to allow you to really maximize your power. And then you look at hand placement. Where are your hands? And then if they're not in a good spot, how quickly do you, reestablish leverage with your hands? Like dexterity, comes into play here. How good are you with your hands? Just from that point forward, how well can you stick on a block? Then things like strain come into place. Grip strength, torque, core strength, and just being able to move a guy off of the spot and then keep him there, and then to adapt through the rep, because obviously the running back has an aiming point that's ideal. That's what you're blocking for. But based on what the defender does, based on him reacting to the running back, this is one of the coolest things about offensive line is obviously the offensive line doesn't know what's happening behind him. So say there's penetration for the opposite side and the running back has to shift his path. He has to, bend, bounce, or, cut back, say it's a zone run or whatever. How do you adapt, from that point forward? And a lot of that is lower half, ability, your foot quickness. How well can you feel, a defender moving? How well can you flip your hips and, stay in front of the defender? And I think that all kind of ties into, how you move with your lower half, but also it's hard to really separate that from hand placement, grip strength, core strength, and it all kind of works together. But don't mean to get on a tangent there too much, but I think that may have touched on it a little bit. And then the second level, yeah, I mean, you mentioned it, so much of that, I think that's more athletic ability, I think, than even first level stuff. Whether it's working a combo block, climbing to the second level, or straight up pulling and leading around the edge if you're a tackle, say, or pulling and kicking out, or wrapping if you're a guard or even a center. That's much more athletic ability, getting out on the move and, closing space and taking good angles, of course, is part of that. But there's a lot of sheer quickness, agility, things like that come into play there. So yeah, I think on the move wise, there's just a lot more athletic ability there.
Yeah, when you see an offensive lineman or an offensive tackle who does it really well, they turn into some of the most fun reps as well. Like I still have a very memorable rep in my mind of Christian Darrisaw at Virginia Tech, where he's out on a screen and he is 30, 40 yards at the sideline, still like finding work on a safety. I think he was all the way in the end zone with the ball carrier by the time the play was over. But you can find some really fun reps
Oh
in
yeah,
that way as well.
that's some of the
So
funnest stuff. Seeing big people line up little people in space is fun.
yeah, it is. Yeah, it is.
It's awesome.
Again, I tried to break this out into 5 categories, but because I mean we've kind of just been flowing with it because that's how offensive line plays works, right? Like the base and the core work together, and the hands and the core work together, and the hands and the feet work together. So there really isn't a progression here. So we mentioned core strength, we mentioned grip strength, but I think what we mentioned a lot in that previous topic we just hit is we hit a lot of hands. You talked about placement, grip strength, and so I think that's a good segue into hands. There's a video of Joe Thomas talking with Brian Baldinger that I reference a lot, where he's talking about the appropriate places to latch in pass pro. And it's a lot of places where the casual fan would be like, well, that's holding, but it's not, right? So Joe Thomas is talking about where he wants to latch with that inside hand and where he can maintain leverage with his outside hand. And I think looking back, and I'm trying not to like reference offensive tackles way too far away, so people have some sort of recency when discussing it. But like Charles Cross is the perfect example out of Mississippi State of a guy who just perfect hand placement. Like I mean, there was a lot of with Charles Cross, like his core was incredibly strong and things like that too. But so when you're looking at an offensive tackle's hands, there, what are your core principles there when evaluating a guy's hands?
Yeah, I think timing and placement, strike timing, and then hand placement. But first, the timing aspect, I think, is where you should start because, I mean, if you wind up having good hand placement, chances are the timing of your strike is really good. So yeah, that's just really, I mean, initiating first contact, or this is where, I mean, hands is, there's a lot of nuance here because there's some pass protectors who don't give hands. They don't want you to touch their hands until the last possible moment. And, we know pass rushers want to see hands of a blocker because that's what they work off of. So some blockers take the approach that, okay, I'm just not going to give you my hands. I'm going to carry them low, or I'm going to carry them, up near my waist, and then I'm going to take them away at the last minute. So you're striking at nothing. So there's that whole approach too. That is certainly a viable approach that some guys take, and it works for them. I think probably the most important thing with hands is generally you want to mix it up. Being one way the whole time is probably not good. So if you do see a guy winning, the same way every time, I mean, in college, doing that in the NFL is probably not realistic. So you want to see a guy have multiple ways to utilize his hands, whether that's hand carriage, and just how he initiates contact. Does he take them away? Can he use a flash technique, a bait technique, a snatch technique? All these things, mix it up and keep rushers guessing. And, so when they're studying you on tape, they don't really know, what's coming. And it's a big chess match, between the pass rusher and a pass blocker. So having multiple ways of winning, I think, is really the biggest thing with hands. But yeah, I mean, that's where I would probably start with it. And then we could kind of go in any direction you want from there, probably.
Yeah, there's a lot to it. So yeah, man, I that's a good question. How to take it from here. So grip strength is obviously really important, and some of those best guys who can maintain blocks. I mean, I think of Olu Fashanu is somebody, even though his hands are extraordinarily like undersized, it doesn't make sense how his grip strength is so elite as it was at Penn State. Timing and placement, you mentioned the flash technique, bait technique, man. So I guess, do you find yourself having any sort of bias towards a guy who doesn't like to show hands, who has powerful hands, or do you just say, hey man, if you win, you win?
Yeah, I mean, power, it's great to see the power in the hands, and you see that on film when contact happens and the defender's head snaps back, I mean, that's when you see the power, and that's certainly beneficial, but it's more so beneficial, I think, in spurts. I mean, you're not going to be in pass protection, striking guys hard and snapping their head back. I mean, you're just not going to line up these pass rushers playing football today that way consistently. So yeah, it's nice to have it in your bag and have that power in your hands, for maybe you're utilizing a jump set as a mix up. and you strike this guy, knock his head back, and you disrupt the play, and then yeah, you buy yourself a second. That's great, but you're not going to lean on that. Obviously, I mean, it's just not going to work. So it's just not something you can rely on. So, but yeah, it certainly is nice to have it, and I think that really helps in the run game. And you can utilize those things more so if you're in a heavy play action scheme and heavy RPO scheme and things like that, where you're setting aggressively. Then that puts you in that position more so to do that. Uh, but yeah, generally, again, mixing things up, I think is really important. And in terms of having a bias, I really have a bias just towards guys who, showcase the ability to do multiple things. If a guy can, utilize maybe a two-hand strike, or even a single hand strike and snap a guy's head back like a Tyron Smith, maybe has the most powerful punch in the league. When he lines a guy up and connects, that guy's going to get stunned for a second. But then having the ability to maybe flash that hand and then get the rusher to squint, or kind of, hesitate for a second and then not give any hands or anything to strike on. Yeah, if you could maybe balance those two things, and then I'm like, okay, this guy has a couple things to work with here. Then you look at his length, and then you look at him, shift his body weight and his weight distribution, and he can move, and it's like, okay, we're building something here. This guy can, he has a good baseline here to develop. And then I would say after, maybe the most difficult part too, or maybe not the most difficult, but another aspect of it is after contact is initiated and you're engaged, then how do you use your hands and your feet? Are your hands and your feet tied together? Are your feet a tick slow? Then that can lead to kind of like holding type of situations. Do you move your feet really well? Is your weight distribution good? That will allow for effective hand usage. It's kind of one and the same. They're tied together. If your feet aren't, active and your weight distribution isn't good, I mean, after engagement, your hands, it doesn't really matter what you're doing with your hands. But if assuming those things are good, the ability to like reset your hands, work back underneath, create lift, especially if a guy's going speed to power, like how well do you deal with that? Yeah, I mean, so much of it after being engaged, that's when I think a lot of athletic ability comes into place too. Because then it kind of turns into like a mirror type drill, like one-on-one basketball almost kind of situation where even though you do have hands on, like these guys are so slippery and they're so good with stringing moves together that, you have to be able to move your feet, after contact. So, yeah, I know we're talking about hands, but it's hard not to like bring your feet into the picture too. So
Yeah, it really is. And so I think I want to move on then to what the kind of the showstopper then from a defensive end's perspective. Like once an offensive lineman gets you anchored, like, well, it's a showstopper, right? So, so what I like to look at when I'm looking at a guy's anchor, obviously, is how much blowback does he absorb before he's able to dig his heels in, for one, is something I look at. But I like to see the different types of funky areas they can anchor out of. And I think Tyler Smith is a great example of this. He's got like his Tulsa tape is littered with him. His back is bent over backwards, yet he has like dug all the way in without giving up any ground. And I think that it shows me a lot of flexibility. Tyler Smith is incredibly flexible, but also core strength, right? So, and I think Olu Fashanu is a good example of this as well. Even though I think Olu's probably a little stiffer than I'd prefer for an offensive tackle, but again, he has that elite grip strength, that elite core strength that it's really hard to work through his chest. But what are some things that you look for in terms of a player and kind of evaluating how solid of an anchor they have? If an anchor really can get stronger, those sort of things.
yeah, I mean, I think anchor is really a function of your body strength, your play strength, and also technique and leverage and hands and your body positioning and things like that. So it can be improved because all those things typically can be improved. In terms of body positioning, hands, and pad level technique to a degree. But yeah, I mean, I think to set the stage with anchoring, I think first, just mentioning for people, like it's just totally unrealistic to expect a guy, especially with the defensive lineman with any sort of runway, to like halt and stop movement on contact. That just never happens. You're going to give ground, especially in the NFL. So like you're giving ground. It's just a matter of then, like you mentioned, like how much. Um, and there's sort of like two different ways to anchor. Like there's the hop back technique, which a lot of coaches teach, where you're just trying to take maybe one bigger hop step and then a couple short hop steps back with 2 feet. And then there's sort of like a walk back sort of thing where it's like 1 foot at a time. And then while you're doing this, you're trying to create lift with your hands. Because if you could just picture, a defensive lineman moving in on you, straight forward, head, kind of into you, hands extended, you want to create lift, and that's just going to dissipate the power. So that's where hand placement, strike timing comes into play, because if you're, bending well at the ankles, knees, and hips upon engagement, and then you're also able to kind of punch up, that like with your thumbs up. That's why I call it a strike and not a punch, because there's a pretty important distinction there between a punch. If you think a boxer, like he's punching, a strike is like you're trying to strike up, right? So it's different. So that's why I like calling it strike. It's just, the terminology there is an important distinction. But if you're able to strike up in your anchor, and whether you use the walk back or the hop back technique, and you're able to kind of dissipate his power and maintain the integrity of the pocket, I mean, that's anchoring, and that's kind of relative to the pocket. What is the concept? That's another thing that you have to, especially with anchor, you have to evaluate the concept in terms of the quarterback's depth and where he is in the pocket. Sometimes if he's in the gun and he gets the snap, and sometimes he's not even really going to take any sort of drop, and then let's say he's 5-6 yards behind the line of scrimmage. Dude, I mean, especially as a guard anchoring in that situation, if you give up a little bit of ground, you're almost in the quarterback's lap. So, ideally in that situation, the quarterback gets off the ball quick. But if it's covered and the quarterback has to hold on the ball for an extra second, and the rusher's pushing you into the quarterback's lap, well, you may think, okay, this guy doesn't have a great anchor. But if you consider that concept and maybe the timing of it being disrupted, his anchor was actually really good right there. But that's kind of on the quarterback, and maybe the defense did a really great job. And so that's an important part, is looking at quarterback depth to determine if the anchor was actually good or not, especially for the interior guys again. But and then like how they're pass setting at tackle, I would go into that, like vertical setting or 45-degree setting or flat jump setting. Like DeJuan Jones, a big reason why he had success last year, in my opinion, was he was a heavy vertical setter in pass protection. And that kind of, covered up his, I would say, lack of range. Because if he's setting at a 45 a lot, guys, once they do get his outside shoulder, his ability to like turn and like wash that guy up the pocket, or turn into like an athlete and be super quick, is obviously not very good. He's 380 pounds or whatever. But if you're setting him vertical, well, now that corner is so wide that the rusher almost has to try to run through him. And if you're putting him in that position to where rushers more often than not have to run through him, well, the ball's in DeJuan Jones' court then, and you're just putting him into position to succeed. And I think we saw that last year. Now, he does mix it up, and he has some really cool jump sets and things that he does, but those are change-ups. He's predominantly vertical setting, and I think vertical setting works really well with the 330-plus pound tackles that we have in the NFL. Joe Thomas is kind of an anomaly, because he was a heavy vertical setter and he wasn't super big, but he was just such a technician. And so there's always guys that kind of buck the trend. But yeah, the anchoring piece with the quarterback, I think, is one thing. And then, kind of like the type of sets or, another thing. And yeah, so I know we're going in different directions, but I think we're covering some good angles here.
I agree. This is again, offensive lineman, everything is just so in unison. It's hard to stay on a linear track when talking about it. But again, something else you mentioned is going to pull me into the mental makeup of an offensive line. You had mentioned, an offensive tackle needs to know the depth of a quarterback's drop, some things like that as well, because of, again, I cover the Browns as well. So I think I'm pretty familiar with DeJuan Jones. I'm pretty familiar with Jedrick Wills. And I think where Jedrick Wills has fallen short a lot of the time for how highly touted he was and how good his Bama tape was to come into the NFL. And it's just still trying to figure things out in year 5. Is that sometimes I don't think the mental makeup is there for him to understand the depth of his sets versus where the quarterback is. And so he's setting 45 really wide for some 3-step drops sometimes, and he's getting his face crossed, and he's not redirecting very well, and he's giving a really immediate pressure, and some things like that. And so I think we've hit on it a lot, but there is a massive mental side to playing offensive tackle, and that's just one area of it. And I think a lot of draft nicks and people who do draft content, I think a lot of the mental makeup kind of starts and stops at identifying the end man on the line of scrimmage. And there's so much more to it than that, right? There's so much more than just understanding who his man is pre-snap.
Yeah. I mean, you bring up Jedrick Wills, and that's a tough one to figure out, because you can't think of a better situation for a guy playing next to Joel Bitonio too, and being coached by Bill Callahan and still having these persistent mistakes that calls into question other things. But just looking at mental processing from an offensive line perspective, there's a lot of layers to this one as well. But some of your notes and some of the things that you said, I think, is a good place to start for tackles and pass protection. I think what you're alluding to really is like set points, and adjusting your set points based on the passing concept and where the quarterback's going to be, and also who you're facing, and also what the front is, and also what the down is. Like, I mean, it does get pretty complex, but generally speaking, you want a guy to get to a spot first and to be inside out on the pass rusher. There's different kind of nuances here. Like, one that makes sense to me in terms of the relationship you want to be in on a rusher as a tackle is if you're taking a 45-degree set, which it differs for every set, but a 45-degree set, say, which is probably the most common in the NFL, you want to have like a knee to crotch relationship. So your outside knee to their crotch, basically right down the center, their midline. And that's going to keep you inside out. Now, obviously, you're going to be in that relationship for less than a second. But if you can get to that point and you can be there first, well, I mean, you're going to be in such a better situation, because you're going to just have the ability to, kind of dictate terms to the rusher at that point. Whereas, again, it comes back to snap timing. If you're a tick late off the ball, and that rusher just, is able to, gain that little bit of ground on you, you're never going to get in that relationship, and you're going to be kind of in recovery mode from the jump. And that rarely ever works out, unless you're one of the special ones. So, getting to the spot first, being square, that knee to crotch relationship. And a lot of that is timing based and maybe some athletic based, but it also is processing based. Just knowing where to be based on that concept. So that's one aspect of mental processing. I would say definitely like handling, line games and twists, which starts pre-snap, being able to identify. This is where studying film as an offensive line unit, as a team, in the offensive line room, as an individual, all these things come into play, because then, you're going to be able to identify keys and tells quickly, whether that's, defensive linemen being aligned different, their depth is different, they're leaning. Maybe if they're in a 3-point stance, you see them look kind of heavy on their hands, or if they're a 2-point stance, they're leaning a little forward, or all these little things change. If anything's out of the ordinary, okay, that's a heads up. Maybe a game's coming here. Maybe a twist is coming. And it's third down, and it's second and long. Okay, chances are it's coming. So, being able to identify all that pre-snap, that's kind of where it starts. But then what we see typically on film is post-snap, and then that's kind of a function of pre-snap. But seeing it on film is, what are your levels like with the guy next to you? Say tackle guard, you want to be on the same level. If you get too shallow as a guard and you have to pass off a TE stunt, well, chances are there's going to be penetration because you're not on the proper level with the proper depth and spatial awareness with the guy next to you. So seeing how guys play off of each other and next to each other with in terms of depth and spacing is really, I think, kind of an indicator of mental processing as well. That's also where like continuity and things like that come in for offensive line play and why that's so important because those things usually are better at that point. But yeah, that's another aspect. I also think a big one in the run game is like combo blocks, knowing when to release to the second level and when to stay. Because if a linebacker, say a deuce block, tackle guard working a 3 technique to a backside linebacker on power, the front side of power or even duo or whatever, say that backside linebacker is kind of slow to read it and he's not scraping over the top. Well, does that tackle hold into place on that 3 technique, or was he already releasing prematurely and then all of a sudden that 3 technique is slipping off the guard? Well, that's probably on the tackle because he should have been thick on that double team and not left anywhere and chased anything because that linebacker wasn't even coming. So maybe he was wrong here and he didn't really process that correctly. Or if he's screaming across the top and he's scraping, is he just giving a quick bang down and then is he popping out to get that guy? And does he do it with good timing? That's processing, I think a lot of the time, just being able to read a defense and, how a linebacker is reading it. So I think like combo blocks and the timing of those and in terms of staying or releasing based on what the defense does, that's an underrated one. I think that is one of my favorite ones to look for on film. And I'm sure there's a lot of other examples for sure, but those are some mental processing things that I look for on tape that can kind of give you a little insight into that skill.
I love it. I love it. All right, Brandon, just a couple more things here. First thing, so we went through pretty in depth there, quite a few aspects and traits of playing offensive linemen. But we often hear in the draft content community, I think that guy projects better to the inside at the next level, right? That's a pretty common thing to hear. I think that he plays tackle at Texas A&M, but I think he's going to be a guard at the NFL level. So when you're saying that, what are some things that tip you off to that? This guy's probably not a tackle at the NFL level.
Yeah, I go to pass protection first and what I call range, especially if they're not like, prototypical size wise and they're maybe kind of like teetering, maybe like a guard size type guy. If that's the case and their range is not very good, which is kind of a function of athletic ability, sometimes technique too, but athletic ability, then that's the first step usually for me to say, okay, maybe this guy needs to play guard. And what I mean by range is, you want to try to find those reps, which can be very difficult to do on college film, but depending on the school, but you want to find as many reps as you can of guys executing a true drop back passing game. So no RPO, no play action. And when you find those reps, hopefully they also are on an island against a pass rusher that's not a 5 technique. Like I'm talking, wide 9 or go 7 technique or something wide to where the tackle actually has to set out and create space off the line. Because if he's in a 5 technique, you see this a lot in air raid and in the like Big 12, type conferences, they're playing 3 down linemen and they got 2 5 techniques in the nose or whatever. And the tackle doesn't have to do anything. He doesn't have to go anywhere. He just, short sets it and, his hands are on and then he dominates the rep. Okay. I want to see wide 9 or something difficult, with no help. And then how are you setting out there, getting to your spot? Are you getting to your spot on time? Are you square? How's your relationship? And then, say you're facing a good pass rusher, and he's able to set you up and get your feet stopped. And then he's able to go outside and string something together. How well do you redirect outside and carry him up the arc? and protect the corner. That's your range, and I want to see those type of situations. And then also kind of playing off of that, okay, after that, then later in the game when he starts countering inside, are you able to still stay square and not cheat and anticipate because you don't have maybe the best range? Are you able to, kind of maintain your discipline and technique and then handle inside counters well in those type of situations? And if one of those things isn't great, or if both those things aren't great, and you're kind of, a tweener in terms of size, all right, well, let's start thinking more about a guard projection here. And then you want to look at play strength, competitive toughness. Um, you know, so okay, maybe this guy isn't super comfortable on an island and pass protection, but man, he looks really good on those jump sets when he has play action to his advantage and RPOs and these five techniques, and he's able to get hands on quick. Man, he locks these guys down. He has a strong anchor. He's physical. Okay, now that's a guard. Like he's, at least to me, that's somebody who I would want to, I'd feel comfortable projecting inside. And yeah, so that's kind of like, my checklist. There might be some other things here and there that come into play, but to me, I think those are the things that really lend themselves to a good guard. And I think those things are pretty persistent across, you look at Joe Tooney, Zach Martin, Brandon Sheriff, I mean, Joe Bentonio, Elijah Vera Tucker. I mean, the list goes on. We all know, there's so many of those guys. And these were all really good college offensive tackles in big conferences. These guys were really good, winning awards, All-American, playing good players. But I think when you isolate these sorts of situations, you just feel more comfortable with them inside. So yeah, it's never like an exact science, but that's kind of my process and how I would go about it.
Gotcha. Awesome. So last thing here, Brandon, I think one of the hardest parts of being an evaluator is you have all of these notes, strengths, weaknesses, but then it can get a little dicey projecting, well, what can be improved upon at the next level, or what is kind of a trait that, whether it's physical, whether it's mental, that competitive toughness that isn't, physical, or isn't technique, I should say. What can be, as you're projecting guys the next level, like, he doesn't have this yet, but he can have it with some training. This can be developed versus he doesn't have this. And this is something that typically I haven't seen translate to the next level if you don't have it at the college level.
Yeah. I mean, well, the things that you're born with, like obviously aren't going to be improved upon, like, well, the obvious ones, height, weight, arm length, those type of things for sure. But then even like athletic ability, I don't, unless you're coming from like a D3 school and you've played football for a year or something, then okay, yeah, you could get stronger and more athletic, and you're 21 years old, like there's still some physical development there. Then yeah, maybe those can be improved at the margins, but by and large, if a guy's 23 or something coming into the NFL and he's from a Power 5 school, which is kind of like what we typically see, chances are that guy's not getting much more athletic. Chances are he's not getting that much more strong, because I mean, he may have a better weight room in college than the pros anyway. So yeah, I mean, I think athletic ability, play strength, and like measurables, like those things probably aren't getting that much better. The things that do get better are technique, or can get better, I should say, or technique. But even that's not a given, especially over the last 5-6 years. Is like, the off-season program stuff has changed, and there's just less time to practice in full pads, and so and a lot of offensive line coaches, as I've learned over the years in the NFL, they're run game coordinators. So really, they're predominantly like focused on teaching you the scheme and like defensive fronts and all of how to operate within the system, whereas technique takes a back seat. Unless there's some coaches that really are really good with technique, but I would say it's not the norm. I would say it's the exception for sure. So even that, I mean, it could be improved upon probably more easily than like athletic ability and play strength, but that's not always a given either. But I would say technique, and when I say technique, like understanding body positioning more, set points, like angles of departure, out of your pass set, how to get to spots, more creatively, how to use your hands, better, getting off the ball, snap timing, initial quickness, those things can be improved upon. So yeah, those are some things that I would say that could be improved. But again, it's kind of tough to say for sure. That's why I think, the whole discussion about evaluating a player in the media versus an NFL team and like the advantages and disadvantages of both. One of the advantages of being with the team, I would say, is who the offensive line coach is. You can go to practice. You can talk to him. You can kind of get a feel and an idea based on his track record, especially of, is this guy teaching technique? Is he really heavy on scheme? Is he, has he developed guys? And if you are scouting for certain teams, then this whole discussion changes because kind of what you're looking for. But from our perspective, media wise, it's more difficult because you don't know where he's going. You don't know his situation. You don't know who he's playing next to. You don't know what the offensive line room's like. So then it becomes difficult. And I would agree with your original point. Like when you have all these notes and everything, it becomes really difficult to project these guys. The evaluation, I would say, is not easy, but it's easier. The evaluation is very difficult from a media perspective because you just don't know where they're going. So yeah, it's tricky, but hopefully I still answer the question.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Brandon, that's 55 minutes of valuable information there.
Flew by.
It sure did. All these have, every time I sat down with all these guys, the time just kind of washes away because it's just so enthralling to talk about. But Brandon, thank you so much for your time. Again, Brandon Thorn, Trench Warfare. You can tell everybody else all the various places they could find your work at.
Yeah, so trenchwarfare.substack.com would be the main spot, but establishtheRun.com. I'm coming out with my offensive line and defensive line rankings here in the next couple weeks, so I'll be doing that for them. And then Bleacher Report, if you want to see college scouting reports over the last 4 years, you can just Google like my name and the player or Bleacher Report and the player, and if it's an offensive lineman, then over the last 4 years, you can read some scouting reports there as well.
Awesome. Again, thank you so much, Brandon, for your time. You are a welcome guest on the Daft on Draft podcast anytime.
Oh, yeah, dude. This was fun. Thanks for having me.